Mr. Chairman, it doesn't look like, it looks like there are two people. It's Mr. Peterson, so I'll go ahead and get him admitted. And we are now live on YouTube.
Okay, thank you, Abigail. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, committee. Welcome, everyone in the audience. The meeting will come to order. And Abigail, could you take roll for us, please?
Representative Andrew?
Here.
Representative Brown?
Here.
Representative Connolly?
Here.
Representative Harshman?
Here.
Representative Neiman?
Here.
Representative Newsom?
Here.
Representative Obermuller?
Here.
Representative Summers?
Here.
And Chairman Paxton.
Here. I think we'll start with Chairman Harshman. It's kind of his baby here, and so I'm going to call on Chairman Harshman to give us a brief introduction before we get started here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And really, I'll turn it over quickly to Professor Godbee. Professor Godbee has been a fixture in our state for years and works all over the place, and appreciate all his service to our state, and Professor Peterson as well, and appreciate you sharing this. And I'm kind of a newcomer to this, Mr. Chairman. This is the Power Wyoming group Governor Gordon has put together, and part of that is the chair of revenue is on that group. So I've been to one whole meeting, right? And so I'm new to it, but I thought, this is, and members of the committee and the public, so worked with Chairman Paxton and thought, maybe on that Friday, if we got a little extra time, this would be, because I think, and Professor Godbee can talk, they're ready to kind of go public with this, and thought maybe we could get a look at it and ask some questions if we have some, and then kind of see what the future holds for I don't think this is the end of this kind of work, I guess. So thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I'd introduce in Professor Godbee and Peterson, and you guys can kind of introduce yourselves some more. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Representative Harshman. So with me today is my colleague, Mark Peterson, a professor in the Department of Marketing. I'm the Associate Dean of the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources, and also a member of the Economics Department at the University of Wyoming. So it's a pleasure to be here, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I will apologize in advance for animal sounds in the background. I have a bunch of dogs who usually try to Zoom bomb me, but today you can probably hear the pleas. I have a cat that is just desperate to get into this office. So if you hear yowls, he's actually shoving his little paw underneath the door to try to break in. So I don't know how much longer I can hold him back. But if I'm suddenly inundated with a pack of dogs or a cat that won't get out of my face, you'll know what happened, and I apologize for that. Let us get started with the research that we were hoping to show you today. This is work that Professor Peterson and I have been working on for a while now. And what we were trying to do for the Power Wyoming group as a starting point, and this work began to happen before COVID occurred, with the concerns of the structural deficit that we face in the state, or we anticipate facing, and then of course the concerns of COVID. A big concern is, how do we deal with the budget choices that we have in front of us right now? And so what we're going to show you are the results of an initial survey that tries to determine what people's preferences are, not over specific policies, because we're not at that point yet. We didn't want to drill down to specific policies. What we're asking here is, how do people prefer us to do this in broad strokes? Would we prefer cuts to agencies, possibly cuts to local and county governments, cuts to K-12, or do we prefer revenue increases, or do we prefer to just use our savings? And I apologize for the cat in the background. So what we are trying to do here, and I'll let Professor Peterson chime in as well, is instead of using a standard survey, which often is called an elicitation survey that asks people to identify, on some scale or whether they support or not questions, you'll find that those surveys are often of limited use. For one thing, the results can be dependent on the way the questions are framed. And oftentimes people will often tell you that everything is important. And so how do you figure out what's most important? There are some methods of doing that in those surveys. You can ask people to rank things, but it's very difficult then to get people to consider trade-offs. So in a budget problem like this, if you decide to spend or continue to spend funds in one area, if you're facing a budget deficit in a place like Wyoming or one of the 49 states that requires budgets to be balanced, then you're going to have to give something up in another. So how do you evaluate those trade-offs? And then the other thing that is difficult to identify in standard survey methods is how to identify how preferences, support, or opposition for a policy might change as you change the mix of policy actions. And so those are issues with standard survey methods that you might have seen. And I'll let Mark speak to this in a second, but what we do is we use a marketing product development technique, actually. It was developed to produce products to address these issues, where you can actually ask people to look at things and tell you how they're willing to trade off, say, one characteristic against another. And we use those in the policy environment. And I'll just ask Mark if he is willing to kind of describe that in a little more detail here.
Sure. Can you hear me?
I think you might have two microphones on, Mark, so you might need to mute one of them.
You've got quite an echo going there.
Let me leave.
If you like, Mark, I can take this, and I think one of the problems is I think you're logged in on a phone and your computer, and so we're getting a feedback issue. But if you like, yeah.
Go ahead, Rob.
Okay, I'll take it. So here's an example of how this might be used. So imagine you're trying to identify a particular phone that people prefer most. So a cell phone. So you could be looking at various characteristics like the brand, the screen size, maybe the color of the phone, and the price. And what will happen in marketing is very often what you'll do is you'll give people combinations of products to try to and the characteristics of those products. And you'll ask people through a round of questions to choose in some set of choices which one they prefer. And in repeatedly doing this, you can identify the preferences that are most important to them through some statistical methods that can be complicated, but the results are kind of straightforward. So another way you could think about this is imagine you were a company and you were trying to think about what would be the optimal phone to offer to the market. And you might think about a phone that's larger and has a larger screen. You might think that it has a brighter screen and it has a certain amount of battery life. And that battery life will trade off and will be less if you have a larger screen or a brighter screen. And so what you'd do is you'd go through combinations of battery life, screen brightness, and size. And through those questions of individuals, you can identify individual preferences over, what combination of those characteristics would be they'd be happiest with. And you can also identify over a population what the population prefers most. And so, and again, I apologize for my dogs who've decided to interrupt now as well.
Maybe I could jump in now.
Okay, so, and I'll let Mark take it from there, and I'll mute my.
Okay, great. I'm so pleased to be with you today. What you're seeing here is what corporations use in new product development. So my thought a few years ago was, hey, in policy, why don't we see these techniques being used as well? So what this design is a conjoint design, but the important thing is that trade-offs are imposed on the respondent. So to get something, they've got to give up something. And in that environment, we see more realistic preferences. So maybe Rob could, are there any questions right now about this technique? Rob, can you advance the slide? Okay. Yeah, and also that our first study was done with the budget in 2016, and we had respondents from Wyoming, every county, and Dan Zwanitzer, Chris Rothfuss worked with us. They were there at the very beginning, and they've helped us develop this design, and it's been vetted in a publication, a journal called Journal of Public Policy and Marketing. So it's one of the top ones in our field. Go ahead, Rob. Okay, maybe you can go back.
There we go. So let me go back one and just tell you what we did. So what we did was using this kind of choice exercise. We told people participating in the survey that there was a hypothetical approximate $480 million deficit in the biennium. It's relatively close to the conditions that are here, and we then gave them choices which we estimated how a deficit of that size would be affected. We also included the cuts that were made to agencies in the summer of 2020, which we'll describe in a minute. And we were told people that they need to balance the budget. And so they're given three broad choices. We didn't give them specific proposals, but we said, one choice is we can increase revenues in the state. And we presented it as personal increases in personal taxes paid, sales or property taxes, but we didn't have any details. We didn't offer an income tax, for example. We kept to the taxes that are available. We also said that another way you could deal with this is to decrease spending. So we gave them three choices in that area. State agencies, including higher ed, and we're assuming across the board cuts. Cuts to possibly transfers to counties, cities, and towns, or cuts to K-12. And then finally, if you don't want to do those things, or you can do both of those things, as well as you can use our savings account, the rainy day fund. So what we presented to them was a series of choices that kind of follow this design. So basically, level one of choices would be no change in any of these four areas. And of course, that would mean the entire $480 million deficit they faced would be covered by the rainy day fund. Then we offered them 5% changes in each of these areas. So a 5% increase in personal taxes, 5% cut to K-12, 5% cut to all agencies, or a 5% cut to cities and towns. And then we also had a 10% level in all of those areas. It's important to recognize that in the numbers we showed them, we told them that there had already been a 10% cut or a 10% cut across agencies in the summer. So that additional 5%, they were understanding to mean a 15% cut in total. And then we showed them how those changes would affect the budget choice that they faced. So what happens is you can mix and match these choices. For example, you could have a 10% revenue increase and a 10% K-12 cut. You could have no change in state agencies and possibly a 5% cut to cities and towns. There are a lot of combinations just in this simple design between no change, 5, and 10 in each of these four areas. And of course, every one of your choices implies either a draw from the rainy day fund, or in the case of if you chose all of the choices at level 3, so a 10% cut in every area and a 10% revenue increase, you actually result in a surplus and actually a deposit to the rainy day fund. So those were the areas. And what people faced was a series of questions. So we can't run people through every single alternative. So what we did was we presented to the people in the survey some subset of those alternatives. So this would be one screen, and they would be faced with 3 alternatives of a set of policies across those areas. And then they would also be shown how much of the rainy day fund was used in an amount and also a percentage. And they were told how much before this started was assumed to be in the rainy day fund. So based on that percentage drawdown, they could also mentally figure out how long the rainy day fund might last if no more deposits were made into it, for example. So they were asked to, first of all, choose which set of policies they would prefer. And we would ask that, so they would check a button. And then we would also ask them, do you actually support that policy? Do you support it with concerns, or are you against it? So even though we're forcing them to choose one that they like best, they may not be in favor of it. So, and I often use the example of, imagine somebody told you you're getting a punch in the face or a kick in the stomach. You're not going to like either one of those. But if you're forced to take one or the other, you might have a preference over which happens. And we do this repeatedly. And from an individual's responses and from the individual responses across the sample, we can then estimate what the state preference is across the population and also subpopulations of what their preferences are in terms of how would they prefer us to go about addressing this problem. Would they prefer us to look at revenues, at cuts to different agencies, or to use savings? So that's how this works. And the idea is to really get at, if we're going to start to tackle this problem, not the specific policies, but more how to support change as you address the policy by using a certain type of action, whether that's revenue increases, cuts, or cuts to, or use of savings. The sampling was done after the election, so in mid to late November and through the first 2 weeks of December. We did get answers from all counties in the state, all 23 counties. We had over 480 people take part in the online survey. It was administered by a partner of ours called SDR Consulting in Atlanta. They've done work in Wyoming with us before. They were the ones that were able to identify the survey group, which is not an easy task when you're looking for representation from all counties proportionate to their population. At the end of the survey, we used 435 of the responses. The only ones we dropped were those that looked like people weren't actually reading the survey. What we call straight lining, they kept answering the same answer in every single question. So B, 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 B. And the other thing is, how fast did they do it? If they did it in under 4 minutes, we presumed that they weren't actually reading the screens, because none of us could do it in anything close to 4 minutes. So that is what we tried to do to get this survey. And we'll show you the results in a second that give us an idea of what methods are preferred to address the budget problem in front of us, and how support might change if policies are changed in those areas that we identified. Before we go into the results, I'll just quickly say that the sample, depending on how you compare it to the population, is relatively representative. The age cohort and the education cohort is relatively close. There is a bit of a gender imbalance. We didn't quite get as many females as we would have liked. The other thing is that the party affiliation is relatively close, where Republicans are actually identified as being lower than the sample. We did get more people who identified themselves as independent, and then we had slightly fewer who are non-affiliated. These issues can be addressed in sampling, often with weighting. We won't get into that, but we'll just show you the results of what was found. So first, we did some elicitation questions. People had a question from 1 to 7, completely agree or disagree. 7 is agree. And what we asked them were just general background of, do they follow the state budget? Do they follow legislative sessions? Do they feel their representative or senator represents them well? Generally, they were middle of the road in all of those areas. So overall, the sample was not overrepresented by a bunch of people who are just hawks about the deficit, for example, or very, very committed to policy, which would be probably unlike most people in Wyoming. People watch it, but they're not. It's not something that they're obsessive about, nor are they ignoring it completely. So people do have interest in this.
Hey, Rob.
So go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, in studies I've done using a similar approach in the states of New York, California and Texas, there's a similar pattern. So when you actually put it on people and say, could you do a better job than your elected representatives on these issues, those tend to be the lower numbers in that set. So I think that suggests the kind of a realism that the people bring.
Right. So with respect to the results, kind of the headline question here is, what is most important to people? And these are kind of relative concerns. So they total to 100%. So you could think of the share out of 100 represents what's most important and also relatively important. And what came across in our survey was that K-12 funding is the biggest concern people have, and it's followed closely by increases in taxes. They're concerned by everything, as you can see, but the relative level of concern falls if they're thinking about state agency funding or decreases in cities and towns. So one way to think about this is, how would support decline if you had to make any of these decisions? And what leads to the least decline in support, or the least opposition, is initially using rainy day funds, which of course is probably what we're going to have to do outside of making major changes elsewhere. Then you can see that decreases to state agencies and cities and towns would be preferred next. And then you could see that the last two that are most concerning to people are the ones where probably the biggest changes can be made in K-12 funding or increases in taxes. Now that's across the entire sample. If we look at it, say, by party affiliation, you see the same patterns. So while you might think that parties may be radically different, they really aren't. You can see really the biggest difference is maybe, and I apologize for some of the spelling mistakes on these slides, they were made relatively quickly. What you'll see there is that Democrats show maybe the biggest difference on taxes. They're a little more, well, a little less in opposition to changes in taxes than they are to relative to the other groups. But you see the same pattern across the board, regardless of, say, what political affiliation respondents were. We see that general pattern that we summarized in the last slide. So we have a little survey tool that we will distribute to you. If you're willing to have it, we'll send it to Abby or Abigail, and she can send it out to you. And you can actually use this tool to identify how support would change as you changed any of these policies in 1% increments. But the baseline policy of doing nothing and then using the rainy day fund to cover the entire budget deficit garners about 42% support in the state. So less than a majority of people would support doing that. Now, what I'll warn you about is that given the situation we're in, nobody really likes it. So you find negative support over the entire situation, and that's probably not surprising. I'll take you back to the choice of the punch or the kick. This is a bad situation. There's really no way to get out of it. We didn't, and so people are going to indicate that they're not happy about it. But the baseline level of support, if we did nothing from where we were this summer, would give us about 42% support. If we were to look at how that support would change if you just changed one area of policy. So for example, the red line at the bottom there is reducing K-12 funding. That would lead to the largest drop of support the most quickly. So you can see if you were to leave everything else unchanged and decrease funding by 10% to K-12, you actually reduce total support from 42% to about 32%. So you lose 10% support. It's not quite as dramatic if you were to raise taxes by 10%, leaving everything else constant. What you can actually see, and where we approximately are now, is support was actually rising if you were to cut agency budgets up to approximately where we are now. So we're kind of at a sweet spot. The additional approximately 5% cut that wasn't made to all agencies, but the cuts announced in November by the governor, they bring us to kind of a sweet spot. Past that point, that actually caused an increased support but past that point, you see support start to decline. You can see that the sensitivity to local funding actually can lead to a slight increase in support. But if you look at the numbers, county and local government funding is actually not a very large amount of total expenditure. And probably one of the reasons that you don't see a lot of sensitivity there is it doesn't really change the problem too much. In our survey, we told them that the maximum you could really change it was about $30 million, given the choices that we had for them. So this just gives you a sense of how, relatively speaking, how important these things are and how quickly support could change if you only changed one policy at a time, leaving everything else constant. So you might ask, well, what is the optimal policy? In other words, what would lead to the most support in the state? And from the choices we gave people, that would be doing nothing about property and personal taxes effectively, not changing K-12 funding, leaving the state agency budget cuts about where they are now, and then maxing out the city and town cut at a 10% cut. And that just reflects the fact, you can see there, that it makes a relatively small dent on the budget. And it may reflect other considerations that we are unaware of. They may be thinking that, well, those cities and towns are then able to address their needs through, say, local taxation versus statewide response. You'll see that this optimal response just takes us past a majority support to about 50%. So if you were to add kind of a confidence interval around there, we're at about even. It could be possible that, given statistical sampling, that support wouldn't be quite 50%, or it could be a little higher than that. But broadly speaking, this is the best we can do. So this is kind of the optimal choice across people right now. And so what does it tell us? It tells us that really people in the state are really not ready for major changes in either personal taxes or K-12 education funding. They're willing to make the changes that we've made to this point, but they're not willing to go much past that. And so it gives us a starting point. Of course, if we were to draw the rainy day fund at this level and not replenish it, there would be a sustainability question that would come into effect. So I can show you actually a few more samples of what this looks like, but broadly speaking, the results kind of come to this, and then maybe we can answer your questions, that reductions to K-12 are the most important concern among citizens in Wyoming, but they're not far and away the most concern. Personal taxes are relatively close second, but increases in taxes, if we're going to make one of those major moves, at least smaller changes initially may be less opposed than changes to K-12, suggesting that there might be kind of a possible order or priority order to approach the problem. That's one way to talk about it. The current agency cut level is, while it's not something people are happy about, is a supported level, and past this level, support would begin to fall. We're not sure if that's a stable outcome. I'll come back to that because this is a relatively recent change. It may be as the effects of those cuts cut in, it may affect people's preferences. So what we can say is there's really not a clear consensus on a workable solution that fully addresses the structural challenge we might have. But all that said, while there might be maybe a contradictory or possibly unsustainable approach right now, what you can also say is, in addition to just making policy changes, you could start to create a dialogue. Communication about, for example, education strategies and what their effects might be, or how different tax policies might affect people, might make a difference and could change people's willingness to consider these things once they know more. One of the things that we did check after this survey was, did people feel like they had a good understanding of the problem in front of them? And they were all, we got very strong results that they did understand it as it was presented to them, at least on these broad descriptions. So what you can say is, one thing that might be useful in the future is tools like this could be used more often to see, first of all, how changes in public attitude might allow the political room to start making additional policy choices, maybe tougher choices. And it might be the case that if we were talking about it more and talking about the trade-offs and what they might mean, this might actually change those preferences. And so we could use a survey like this over time to see how those attitudes might change. Similarly, it may be the case that cuts to agencies, as severe as they are right now, if they result in real pain, could result in changes as well. And we could document that over time, which might mean that the preference to do other things like raise taxes or cut elsewhere might be more preferred than they seem to be right now. And you could also use tools like this to actually create more specific policies than the broad ones that we showed you. So with that, I won't take too much of your time. I know some of you want to get on the road. I'll just stop it there and maybe open it for questions. And if there's comments that Mark has, maybe he can share those as well.
Do we have any questions from the committee? Yes, Minority Leader Conley, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Professor Godby. I always love your presentations from Years in Revenue. And hello to my neighbor, Professor Peterson. We actually live a block away from each other, and he sponsors a wonderful block party in the summer, except for this year. So it's nice to see you. But I do have a question, and it's going back to one of the original slides where you outlined the scenarios for people to choose from. And, and it included taxes, education, funds for locals and state agencies. But there were some assumptions that were in there. One of the assumptions being, well, the first one is that each of them might be equal. And then as you point out, the amount of funding that goes to local governments is nowhere near as equal as the cost or the expense of K through 12 education. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that. And also, if I remember correctly, that slide, when we talked about state agencies and cutting state agencies, it was always about a cut, I think. And I'm just curious about that choice. Was there ever the ability, okay, here we go. Oh, state agencies, there was a no change. Okay. So that was, let me just ask about the state agency one first, because I honestly think I was wrong in my quick reading. You kept it consistent between level 1, level 2, and level 3, that each one of them would be cut the same. Okay, so can you go back to then the reality that each one of these honestly is not equivalent in terms of its impact on the budget, and how does that play out with your results?
Right.
If at all.
So I think I'll take a stab at answering your question first, and then I'll offer Mark any comments as well. So we showed them both the amounts. So I'll just go to the next screen. So this would be kind of a sample. So this is the universe of choices, if you want to think of it that way, the different levels that could happen in each of these areas. And we also identified how much that would impact the hypothetical budget that they were facing. And you're absolutely right. Different things are more or less important. I will also say this about the state agency cut. The state agency cut assumes, so no change is actually where we were when we designed the survey in November. But of course, then the governor came out a week before we did this and said, we're going to add 5% to it. So what we were very clear to tell them was, remember, we have already made a 10% cut. So this is after the cuts that were made initially. And so they could see both the effect on the, so I guess I'll answer this in two ways. First, we kept the percentage levels the same, just so that they would be able to remember them. So 0, 5, or 10% across the board. The only thing that will be different from that will be the draw on the rainy day fund. But then what we would show them as well is how much that impacted the deficit. And so if you were to look at specific choices, for example, they could see that for example, on this page, in alternative one, if you increased personal taxes by 5%, we were telling them that that was going to decrease the deficit by about 70 million. You can see that the transfer to cities and towns at 5% is only affecting it by 15 million, and so on. So they could see the relative difference in these choices. And then they could also see the total drawdown on the rainy day fund. And we told them what the percentage level that was. So we did give them information not only about, a equal percentage change in terms of the policy outcome, but we also told them that those do not amount to the same dollar change. And I think maybe that's what you were identifying. So we made sure that they were well aware of that some areas of the budget are much more important than others in terms of what you need to do to balance it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Dr. Godby. This is exactly the slide that I found curious, in that your choices aren't always the same with your alternatives. So in alternative 2, for example, you're choosing to maintain the transfer to cities and towns, but decreasing K through 12. On the alternative 1, you're not changing education, but decreasing in both state agency and transfers to cities and towns. It would seem to me, and like you pointed out from the beginning, that the permutations of these choices are far more than the 3 alternatives that you gave people.
Right.
And so I'm just curious about that. Where you're comfortable that these are the correct 3 alternatives to be given to your survey participants for us to get a good handle on what their choices are.
Okay, thank you for the good question. This is one of 10 choice sets that people were presented.
Okay.
And so what you see here on the screen in the matrix, the contents, that has been designed through a mathematical design. So it's been done in a program called SAS so that we can get it correct and get it the right configurations for alternative 1, 2, and 3 that would go across, they change across the different sets. So at the end of it, then our conjoint analysis technique allows us to derive the relative importances for these different attributes over here on the left side of the screen: property and sales tax, K-12 agencies, the rest.
Yeah, so I could add to that. So the way to think about this is, because we're not going to have somebody sit here for 2 hours and think of every permutation. What we do is we give a randomly generated, effectively, sample of possible policies that you would see, Representative Connolly, and then if Chairman Paxton did the survey, he would see a different set of choices. And so what we are able to do is, from those sets of choices that you see, we can begin to understand what's most important to you by your choices and how you support them. Chairman Paxton might see a different set of choices, but again, because they differ in whether it's taxes or cuts to K-12 or something else, and by the level, we can begin to figure out by how he chooses across the different sets of choices he sees what his preferences are. And then if we did it for the whole committee and the whole population of the state, you can then use that idea to estimate, okay, what is the general population preference? So it's a lot like that phone example I gave you. You might want a really large screen that's really bright with very little battery life. But it may be the case that Chairman Paxton would prefer to see a smaller screen, and he wants long battery life, so he's okay if it's a little bit dimmer. And then we could look at the whole committee's choice. If we were trying to sell you, since we can't offer you each a custom phone, what is the type of phone that the market would prefer best? And that's kind of the way the marketing method is used for this policy, to identify across the population what approach to combination of policies would people prefer or support the most. They're not going to be happy about all of them, because these are not happy choices, right? Raise taxes, cut services, or use the state's savings account. So that's why we don't see a lot of support for any of these things. These are not happy days. But you can see that among bad choices, or among choices that they're not happy about, let's say, there are some that they prefer more to others. And so the idea is we randomly show you a combination of policies, and then we do this multiple times. And we sample you and the other 434 people that participated in the survey. And from that, we get kind of a global level of people's demand or willingness to support or oppose different combinations of choices. So it's kind of like a searching method defined in some ways. What are the choices you would prefer most? Or we can identify that, and we can also identify it across the population.
Great, thank you. I understand it a bit better now.
Okay, and I think I saw a hand up from Representative Harshman a while ago. Do you still have a question? Okay,
Chairman,
any other?
my question was answered, but I just want to, before we break, and again, I want to thank you for allowing this to happen today, Mr. Chairman. And I think, it's just another piece of this whole conversation that we're going to have. And I think, Professor Godby has talked about this, and I've said it. I mean, it needs to be a good conversation. It doesn't have to be an angry conversation, but it needs to be a conversation we got to have. And I think part of it, a big part of having any conversation, is make sure we got the right facts. We got the facts, period. Because I think sometimes in the world we live in with instant information, everybody's got different facts. And so if we can start nailing this down and all agree on, what is the deficit? What does it look like? And then we can start working towards solutions. Because I think this committee is really going to be maybe the tip of the spear to kind of lead the rest of the legislature in understanding this, and particularly how it affects, all the schools in our communities. So appreciate the work that's been done. And I guess I would end with a question. What is the next plan, professors, is Power Wyoming, what's your next survey? Where does this go from here then?
So I can't speak for the committee, but being a member of the committee, I think where we were last spring before COVID arrived was really beginning that conversation, going out to the state. We actually made a presentation in Powell. There was the governor's conference that happens annually in November, the business conference in Cheyenne, where we had a panel about this. Where we were back then was actually going out on the road and talking about having a series of conversations across the state in various communities to talk about this, and to have people. What we had in Powell was a great conversation. It was really good, because after we finished talking at the front, what really happened was the public started talking, and they were answering and asking questions of one another as they worked through the choices that they had and what they might mean. And so I think probably the next step is to really talk about where we are and what choices we have, and to try to communicate that to people so that people feel like they understand the issues, and that they feel included and able to kind of contribute to this conversation. Because to your point, it's going to affect everybody in the state. And so the approach Power Wyoming was taking was to both educate people on what choices there are and what effects they might have. And then secondly, to ask them really to think about what is the unique Wyoming solution to this? Because there's more than one way to skin a cat, and there's more than one way to balance a budget. And different communities and different values, different states will approach these things differently. And so I think the real idea then next was to really try to find out what the Wyoming solution would be, or at least begin to discover how people would prefer to address it.
One of the things I'd like to see is that I think there's a difference in appetite for increasing sales tax as opposed to property tax. And when we lump those together, I don't think we get a good sense of the preference on that. And at some point in time, anyway, I'd like to see us be able to differentiate that and get some data on which one of those two would be the most, the least offensive anyway, let's just say. And with that, I see Representative Obermueller has his hand up over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Godby, I'm just have a couple of questions about the gathering of information, the idea of agreeing on what the numbers are. Does your number of the deficit assume that we have a full capital gain number dropped into your scenario?
Yeah, so the numbers that we used for the deficit, they were hypothetical based on information. So I worked with Don Richards over in the LSO, and he and I went back and forth on trying to identify the number for the deficit we thought was true at the time in late September. And then we looked at how the various changes would then impact the deficit. So those numbers on the impacts. So the answer to your question is we used the best information we had in late September to identify what we thought the deficit was based on what we might imagine could occur. So to your point about capital gains, we did not use any additional information other than what was kind of considered reasonable given the Craig report at the time. And then we used the funding model and what the levels are of expenditure or tax to estimate how a 5% change, broadly speaking, would affect the deficit.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Yes. So is your answer that you did include the capital gain estimate?
We included what we expected at the time.
Okay.
Which and we recognize that clearly since late September, Craig has come together twice, and I'm actually part of that committee. We've since changed those estimates. So broadly speaking, what we presented to them was a hypothetical deficit level. And then we asked them, given that level, if you had to choose different actions and they were worth this much, which would you prefer of those policies?
Okay, thank you. Follow up, Mr. Chairman, just one more question.
Go ahead.
There's a difference, in the view, probably a difference. I'm making an assumption, my own assumption here, that there's a difference on how people that live in a city like I do, I live in Casper, and how the people in the city in my district would answer these questions compared to someone living out in one of the rural areas. And I'm wondering if you identified that in any of your findings. Thank you.
Mark, and maybe you can help me on this. I don't believe we've split out the respondents into, say, urban and rural, or at least Wyoming urban and Wyoming rural. But I see you're nodding that we haven't yet parsed our data that way. We will share with you a tool, though. It's an Excel spreadsheet that allows you to actually parse the data in different ways. So you can do it by party affiliation, you can do it by level of income, you can do it by age, whether people have kids under 18. So we have looked at the data. Those numbers I presented to you were on the total sample, but we can actually, it's a pretty simple tool to use. It's that one I showed you with sliders. So you can just move from 0 to 10% in any area. And then there's a little drop-down box that asks you using which part of the sample. So we will provide that to you, and you can make with it what you want. There are so many different ways to parse the sample that I just didn't feel it was appropriate to show you any specific group because we'd be excluding somebody else. So we just showed you the total outcome.
And we'd be happy to coach you on that tool if you have any questions. It's intuitive. You just start sliding and you see the bar change over there on the right. And that tool, if a corporation had such a tool, they would pay at least $25,000 just for that tool as an add-on. So our partnership with SDR Consulting in Atlanta, they do that for us as part of the package. They really want to see policymakers and legislators use sound research. And so looking to the future with regards to future studies, I think we can get another study done flash to bang and back to you within a matter of weeks. So it's just a matter of if it's similar to this study, then that expedites things, and literally we could tell them to mount the study and begin collecting data, and we probably have it done within a week. So I think we're talking about 1 to 4 weeks with regard, depending on how important it is to deliver that in a responsive way. And a final thought is that this research project, because it's been done in Wyoming, the other 49 states don't have such access to this type of a tool and this type of approach. So information becomes more valuable the more you use it. So the more that y'all discuss what these results mean to you, that's the better it is. And I think it won't be long before people in other states will be asking you about, hey, how did y'all do that?
And I'd like to thank the professors for their generosity in being able to share this information with us. They're going to send this presentation to LSO, and then LSO will distribute it to our members. So if you want to play with that a little bit, I think you'll have that opportunity. Representative Obermiller, did you have another follow-up, or are you?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Okay, Vice Chairman Brown, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Professor Godby, if I could have you stop sharing your screen while we're in discussion, I appreciate that. Thank you. I really, really appreciate beyond belief the amount of work that you guys have put into this. This is some really invaluable data for us as policymakers to have access to. So thank you guys, number one, for bringing it forward. Number two, thank you for taking the time to do it. My question, I've got a few of them, but my first question is kind of a piggyback to Representative Obermuller's question regarding not only do we look at the subsect of somebody in Casper or Cheyenne, which is more urban versus rural, but we also look at the, I would sit there and I would think about what kind of employment do these individuals have? Because certainly in Cheyenne, where we have a very, very high propensity for public employment, I could see that this could very easily be skewed. The responses on this could very easily be skewed, and especially for the amount of school district employees, you may see something like that. So did that technique, did those types of discussions come into your guys' research on this?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. And in the sharing, I apologize if that was inappropriate, but just wanted to show you how the tool can be used really quickly while we were talking about it. It's a pretty intuitive tool. To your question about groups based on occupation, that is not currently in the tool, but it is a question that we asked. So what we can do is go back to our partners at SDR and just ask them to add that to the tool, and we could update it and send it out to you. But we do have occupation. We did ask, what sector do you work in? Is it public sector, K-12? Is it private sector? And we asked, kind of the broad areas that you think about in occupations, is it mining? Is it retail? That sort of thing. So we do have that information, and we definitely would be glad to share it with you.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. And by no means was I frustrated or upset or anything about you sharing. I appreciate you showing that. As a matter of fact, as you were sharing it, I've had 2 constituents send me a text message and asking if they can get their hands on it because they'd like to play with it. So you're creating enough of an interest in this that I think people across the state of Wyoming are going to be interested in this as well. So one of the other questions that I have regarding this particular research really does focus on something that Representative Connolly had said earlier as well, the impact of how these taxes look. And I think even Chairman Paxton kind of laid down on that. The impact of a mill on an individual's, this is what it would mean to your income versus this is what a 1% tax to you would mean on your average spending throughout a year. What that might look like to the average citizen of Wyoming, and whether or not they would be more susceptible to this tax versus that tax based on that type of information. So I know that's not included in this, but are you guys looking at something along those lines in the future with this data that you currently have, how that might change perceptions?
So So thank you for the question. We would be glad, as researchers, we'd be glad to go back to our little rooms and do this for the rest of time. And maybe that just shows how nerdy we are. But we did not want to lead with any specific suggestions of particular policies. So, obvious by its omission is, a question of an income tax, for example. You're absolutely right. And so this goes to the kind of the communication aspect that I mentioned. What you'll often hear is, in order to deal with this problem, we need to maybe change an area by this much, 5%, 10%. That's kind of how we address this. We absolutely agree with you that changing a mill levy or changing the extent to which you impose sales taxes across services, for example, or a wider basket of goods, including food, that could be very important and very different. So really the answer to your question is that when people want to drill down to that point, we could do that. We were very reticent to actually identify any really specific policies, just because once you get into a specific policy, 1 mill or 2, food, no food, includes services, the universe of possible policy choices then just grows exponentially. So the value in a tool like this is to narrow down potentially, for example, groups like this, to what are the policies being considered. And then in a pretty quick turnaround, you can do a survey like this to find out what the preferences are over, say, the set of bills that are currently in front of people, or maybe some subset. So we are willing to do that research. It is costly, and we would have to find funding for that. We're not here asking you for that. We know the state is in trouble already. This was funded by the School of Energy Resources to help the Power Wyoming group. But we found that our partners, Mark mentioned that, research like this is like 25,000 plus to find, what you hear is optimal choice of cell phone characteristics. This type of research is expensive because the respondents are paid. But one of the things you can do is put this, for example, on a set of laptops and take it out to groups where you're meeting with them. And then the survey's done. And really, you're not having to pay those respondents. They're volunteering to walk up to the computer and work through the results. So this can be done relatively cheaply. It just depends on whether you're surveying across the state or whether you're doing it in groups. And then it's just a matter of, can we find the time to program the choices the way you'd like to see them? So it's really a back and forth, and we'd be more than happy to kind of work with people when the time is right. But to answer your original question, and I apologize for going on, the idea was to really keep this at a broad level so that we didn't, by omission or, unintentionally exclude ideas. We kept it very high level.
Following up on,
do you have another follow-up?
Mr. Chairman, no, not necessarily a follow-up, but just another thank you. And also Professor Godby, I think everybody, as far as the legislature is concerned, has heard my dogs bark at least once in these legislative meetings as well. So by no worries there, but I'm right there with you on the dogs Zoom bombing you. So thank you again. Thank you, Mr. Peterson, for your guys' hard work on this. Truly invaluable data. Thank you.
could I add one thought?
Go ahead.
Yes, that Rob talked about replicating this, with laptops out in the state, but this technique is unique in that the results can be computed at the individual level. So everybody in the Senate and the legislature could take this survey, and then you would know where everybody stood on these issues and how important these priorities were. And I just leave that with you to, ponder, but it has that type of power.
Wow. I believe Representative Nyman has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, for the gentleman there, I was just curious, when they were taking the surveys and stuff, was there any information that was given to the folks in regards to how the budget is structured as far as what expenses go to what, and giving them maybe some opportunity to choose, K-12 funding, athletics, whatever, was there any opportunity, would there be opportunity to kind of give folks a breakdown of what we're spending on each portion of education and let them kind of do some selection as far as what they would deem as something that would be important to them, or, you know, what they could maybe see a decrease in or whatever. That was a curiosity to me. So thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. The simple answer is we didn't do that. You can drill down. So for example, if we wanted to see where maybe people prefer to see funds go in K-12, if that was the question you wanted to put out to people, that can be designed. And you could give them, you know, various combinations of funding. You know, do you want to see it more in athletics or you know, student support, something like that. But we did not drill it down in that way, nor did we give them significant information about, for example, the revenue models and how funds flow from revenue sources, if that was what you were asking, towards specific areas like cities and towns. We just kept it very simple, gave them a top line budget number, showed them these broad areas, and then, you know, when they were presented a choice, we just broadly defined it with no details and said, you know, this could reduce the deficit by 70 million in that area. So it's, you could think of that as you know, possibly a strength or a weakness, but we don't have a lot of specific details. So we can't really answer those other questions, but we could design a survey that did that.
Okay, any further comments from anyone on the committee? Well, I'd like to again give a big thanks to our presenters, great information, and we have some really serious challenges ahead of us, and I think we make better decisions with more information, and you certainly increased our knowledge base today, and we are very appreciative of that. Thank you very much for that. And committee, with that, if we have no more business to take care of, I would adjourn the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.